Well, I've always been interested in the sort of transition that took place in Ireland in the late 1950s into the early 1960s. And this book really evolved out of that interest. In the late 1950s, Eamon de Valera, the Taoiseach who had dominated post-independent Ireland, was finally stepping down from his position as Prime Minister and was replaced by Sean Lemass. Sean Lemass became Taoiseach or Prime Minister in 1959 and would really help open up Irish society by developing a number of initiatives that encouraged foreign investment, that began to sort of dismantle the tariff walls that had protected Ireland. And so there was this period of engagement that I've always been fascinated by. And Sean Lemass has always been associated with that. He would encourage Ireland to engage with the Atlantic community, with both North America and Europe especially. And television would emerge in the early days of Lemass's tenure as Taoiseach, and it would help modernize Irish society. And that has always been a really kind of interesting part of contemporary Irish history, the sort of transition between the old guard, the sort of de Valera period, and the advent of Sean Lemass as Taoiseach or Prime Minister. Ireland would emerge from a period of isolation once Lemass became Taoiseach in 1959. The post-war period from, say, 1945 to about 1960 would witness an Ireland that was struggling. Its economy was not growing. There was high levels of unemployment and tremendous levels of emigration. In fact, it's been estimated that upwards of 500,000 people would leave Ireland between the end of the Second World War in 1960. And this would begin to change in the early 1960s when Lemass became Prime Minister, because he would encourage foreign investment and open up the Irish economy. And television would be part of this process of modernization. Television would challenge this sort of status quo. It would undermine the influence of the national press. It would challenge the Catholic Church, and it would also challenge a number of very conservative cultural organizations, such as Gael Linn, which was, of course, devoted to bringing back the Irish language as an important part of Irish culture. Lon O'Brien is one of the more interesting characters in this story. He is a senior civil servant that was involved with the Department of Finance as a young man, and would make the transition to a Department of Post and Telegraphs. Now, the name might sound rather bizarre, but in fact, Post and Telegraphs would later become the Department of Communications, and it would be the department that would be responsible for radio and television. Throughout the 1950s, there'd be debates about television and what form it might take, how it might be structured. Ireland was one of the last countries in Europe to have a native or indigenous television service, and O'Brien was very interested in what form that might take. He would look at the BBC and really appreciate its public service commitment, and would be the sort of prime mover for television to embrace this sort of public service role. He regarded commercial television, whether in the United States or in the United Kingdom, as entertainment, and was much more interested in seeing a public service network develop in Ireland. And throughout the 1950s, he'd be in a very important position. As secretary of his department, he would be the one that would be looking at all the different proposals that would be coming across his desk about how a service might be established. There were a number of foreign companies interested in building a television service for the Irish government, if the Irish government was willing to enable these companies to establish a commercial radio station that could broadcast into the United Kingdom. O'Brien was looking at these proposals that were coming from American and continental entrepreneurs, and was dismayed at the sort of commercial character of those proposals, and would be pushing the government constantly to embrace what he regarded as the best model, and that would be the public service model. And again, he would look at the British Broadcasting Corporation and argue that that was the service that the Irish government should look to, that television should be more than simply entertainment, that it should uplift and educate the masses. He always believed that communications should serve the people, and that a public service should develop programming that would be culturally viable, that would be interesting and educational. One of the most fascinating characters to emerge from this story would be a native of Boston, Edward Roth. Roth grew up here on Mission Hill, a man who was educated at Boston University. He would serve in the Marine Corps in the Second World War and become interested in radio and television while in the South Pacific, serving as an intelligence officer. He made his way back to Boston and ended up taking additional courses and studying at Columbia University, hoping to gain a PhD. However, he had a young family and realized that he had to find work, and quickly began to look at television and the communications industry as a place where he might make a career. He ended up working for NBC and proved a very talented manager. He really enjoyed traveling and spent a good deal of time in South America and Latin America, where he worked for NBC, setting up television stations, first in Lima, Peru, and then in Guadalajara and Monterrey, Mexico. In fact, he was working in Guadalajara, Mexico, when he read an advertisement in a trade journal called Broadcasting. And the advertisement came from Dublin. It was an ad looking for a director general. What the Irish government was looking for was a key individual that could help build a national television service. Roth applied for the job and was interviewed and hired, and spent over 2 years working in Dublin, helping to get the Irish television service off the ground and on the air. He's a fascinating character, a technocrat, somebody that really didn't understand the complexities of Irish culture or politics, but was hired basically to get a service organized, to make sure that the right kind of hires were made, and to see that the technical infrastructure was in place so that a national service could develop. He was the first Director General of what was then known as Televisaron, and he was controversial in many ways because a lot of people criticized his emphasis on television as entertainment. I had mentioned before Lon O'Brien, who was the Secretary of the Department of Post and Telegraphs. O'Brien was horrified initially with Roth because he believed that Roth was really the antithesis of public service broadcasting. What he hoped for was a service that could, again, uplift and educate the Irish people. And when Roth arrived, he was in charge of a television service that was supposed to be both a public service as well as a service that would entertain the viewers. Many argued that Roth wasn't doing enough to sort of emphasize the importance of the Irish language, of Irish culture, of Irish history. And that's one of the reasons why Roth was so controversial. I suppose one of the real problems for Roth was that when he was hired as Director General, he was not brought in to run a public service television station. It was not the BBC that he was taking over. He was beginning a commercial public service, what was really a hybrid. He was given a sort of confusing set of instructions. He was told that the new television service had to both educate and uplift the sort of Irish people as well as entertain them. And so he was challenged in that he was going to try and build a service that could be viable, that could be successful and find an audience. And he believed that to find an audience and to hold that audience, he had to provide entertaining programs. And he looked to the United States for those programs, and especially to Westerns and crime dramas. And these became tremendously popular in Ireland. Again, for Roth, when I mentioned this was a hybrid service, it was a service that was dependent on commercial revenue. So he was selling airtime to advertisers. And he always argued that advertisers were simply not interested in cultural programming that might emphasize the importance of the Irish language, but they were interested in popular programs that would find a wide audience. And Have Gun Will Travel, Wagon Train, Perry Mason, these are the programs that he brought to Television Éireann in the early 1960s. They were popular. They were somewhat dated in an American context, but again, they succeeded in finding and building an audience. And in that way, he was successful. His tenure was a controversial one. It lasted for 2 years. But by the time he left in 1963, he had put in place this infrastructure for a successful service. Well, the new television service did really upset the political establishment of the day. They were used to a national press that was deferential and found it difficult to deal with a television service that employed many young university-educated men and women who were oftentimes aggressive in asking questions about policies and decisions. This was something that was hard for many of the old guard accountants. Many of the sort of revolutionary generation that had been members of the Irish Parliament, O'Doyle, for many years, found it unsettling to be asked questions by young men and women who would not let these parliamentarians off the hook easily. Many political elites of the day were used to Radio Éireann, the old radio service, that functioned really as part of the Department of Posts and Telegraphs, that issued news bulletins, that reported on debates that were taking place in the Dáil or in the Parliament, that reported on international events, but did not produce investigative programs. And that's what took place as the 1960s progressed, is that many of these young men and women that were at first training about how to make programs were really influenced by the programming that they were seeing on the BBC. Programs such as Panorama were really pioneering documentary endeavors that were emulated by many of these young men and women. And as they developed programs that were hard-hitting and really questioning policies, the political establishment found this unnerving. And it took a while for political elites to realize that television could be used to their own benefit if they were sort of smart enough to realize how to use the medium to sort of get their own message out. Television posed a real problem for the Catholic Church in Ireland in the 1960s. The Archbishop of Dublin was a man named John Charles McQuaid, and he was, by all accounts, a fairly reactionary character. John Charles McQuaid had been unsettled by the reforms of Vatican II and had come back from Rome telling his own congregation that they shouldn't worry about any of these changes, that they were really not important at all. In fact, they were very important. And McQuaid was worried that television would really upset the sort of society. He was concerned, especially with American programs and British programs that might address issues of sexuality, that might look at the sort of plight of single mothers or address divorce. And he felt that it was imperative that the Catholic Church have a very substantial say in what might be broadcast. John Charles McQuaid worked very hard to see that one of his own appointees could sit on the television authority that was established by the Broadcasting Act in 1960. He worked behind the scenes for months to try and make sure that one of his own priests could sit on that television authority and report to him about what kind of debates were taking place within the new television service. In the end, he was unsuccessful. People like Edward Roth, the first Director General, the American that I had mentioned earlier, and Eamon Andrews, the chairman of the Broadcasting Authority, were successful in making sure that this appointment of McQuaid was not successful. Again, McQuaid was a bit of a throwback, and he was seen by many in the inside of this new television service as a person that could create real problems if, in fact, he was able to insert one of his own people onto the television authority. In the end, Edward Roth and Eamon Andrews, the chairman of the Broadcasting Authority, were successful in seeing that a Dominican was appointed to be the religious advisor to Televís Éireann. Now, a Dominican would not be responsible to the Archbishop of Dublin. And when the Archbishop found out that a Dominican had been appointed, he was furious, but there was nothing he could do. This sort of Dominican was not somebody that was answerable to the Archbishop, but he was, a Catholic priest who was a capable advisor, and that satisfied the authority. But again, it did not satisfy the Archbishop. I had addressed the sort of controversy about inserting a Catholic priest onto the television authority. John Charles McQuaid had paid for the education of two young priests, a man named Joseph Dunn and another Des Forrestal, to gain a sort of an understanding of television. In many ways, John Charles McQuaid would be a very proactive archbishop. He was interested in trying to figure out how television might serve his own purposes. And he had paid for Joe Dunn and Des Forrestal to study television broadcasting both in Britain and here in the United States. Joe Dunn and Des Forrestal had studied television in New York and had come up here to Boston, had actually been guests of Cardinal Cushing in the early 1960s, and were interested in how the American Catholic Church was using television to reach an audience of the faithful. Again, Archbishop McQuaid was hoping that he could insert one of these priests onto the television authority, and he wanted to put a man named Joe Dunn onto the authority. In the end, Joe Dunn was not placed onto the television authority, and this was actually, in some ways, a victory for the Catholic Church in Ireland. Joe Dunn would go on to start up his own television company, and it would be called RIARC, which translates roughly to vision from Irish. Dunn would be a very influential character because he would begin making documentary programs that proved very popular inside of Ireland. RIARC initially addressed many social issues inside of Ireland that many people found problematic. Dunn, because he was a Catholic priest, had a certain degree of credibility and was really trusted inside of Ireland. So he made programs about poverty, about alcoholism, about the plight of immigrants who had left Ireland and were struggling to find work in England. Later on, Joe Dunn and a number of priests that worked with him would use a network of missionaries around the world to make programs about life in Africa and in Asia. Dunn, in this way, sort of opened up a window on the world to many people inside of Ireland. Because Dunn was able to successfully exploit this network of missionaries around the world, he was able to travel, freely and rather inexpensively, and make programs about life, with the sort of challenges that peasants in the Philippines were being confronted with in the 1960s. He would look at life in Nigerian villages and also look at life in the United States. And many of these programs found their way onto RT, and they were very popular on Irish television. And a number of them would be picked up by other European public television services. So in many ways, Joe Dunn and this television production company that he started, RIARC, would open up Irish society by simply enabling the Irish people to see what life was like in other parts of the world. One of the most contentious issues for the people that ran television in the 1960s was the Irish language. Edward Roth, the first Director General, and Eamon Andrews, the chairman of the Television Authority, were challenged time and again by the Gaelic League that argued that this national television service was not doing enough to support the Irish language. Now, both Edward Roth and Eamon Andrews would argue that the television service had to support itself, that it had to sell advertising time, and that it had to develop popular programming that would find a wide audience. And they would argue that Irish language programming was simply not popular. They would point to the experience of Radio Éireann that had conducted a number of studies that illustrated quite clearly that many people were simply turning the station or turning the radio off when Irish language programming was featured. And so the Irish language lobby was very unhappy with the new television service in the early 1960s. And this would begin to change towards the end of the decade when a number of young, talented producers began to develop innovative Irish language programs that were a bit subversive, that were highly critical of government policy, that began to ask very difficult questions about contemporary life in Ireland. And they did this through Irish. There would be a number of Irish language programs such as Fiach, which would become very popular. But this would happen in the later part of the decade and not in the early 1960s. In 1963 up until 1966 and 1967, the amount of Irish language programming was very small. And this really infuriated the more conservative members of the Gaelic League, or those that advocated that the Irish language be featured predominantly on the new television service. In fact, this would remain a contentious issue throughout the 60s and 70s into the 1980s, and it would only really be resolved when an Irish language television service was established in the 1990s. And that enabled those that were interested in the language to have a service that, or a channel that was focused on the language and focused on bringing relevant and contemporary programming that would become popular in some areas to an audience that, again, was interested in the language. When television came to Northern Ireland, initially it did not threaten the unionist government there. Television came to Northern Ireland in 1953, just in time for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And throughout the 50s and most of the 1960s, television in Northern Ireland simply was rebroadcasting signals coming out of London. So the BBC and eventually the independent service, Ulster Television, was simply rebroadcasting programs that were being developed inside of Britain. However, when the Civil Rights Campaign began in 1968, this changed things. And television began to cover the Civil Rights Campaign, and this unsettled the political establishment in Northern Ireland. What would take place in Northern Ireland is that many young university-educated men and women would be influenced by the Civil Rights Campaign taking place in the United States, and they'd be especially influenced by the nonviolent methods used by Martin Luther King. They would be watching the American Civil Rights Campaign and looking at the marches that were taking place in Alabama and other parts of the American South, and begin to follow examples that were set by those interested in civil rights for African Americans. And when the television news programs began to cover these marches, that created a great deal of discomfort in the government of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland in the late 1960s was a place where Catholics suffered discrimination, and that's what these civil rights marches were trying to argue, is that that there were those inside of Northern Ireland that didn't have full civil rights. And as these marches took place, they met resistance by the police, by the Royal Ulster Constabulary. There would be one very famous march that would take place on October 5th of 1968 in Derry in Northern Ireland. And in this march, a group of young men and women and parliamentarians, MPs from the Labour government and from Northern Ireland would be attacked by police, and much of this would be filmed. And that film would make its way onto the national network of the BBC and the independent television, and also onto the national network inside of Ireland. And this would really illustrate that there was something wrong inside of Northern Ireland, that this civil rights march, which was peaceful, was being attacked by police. And viewers would be able to see, to witness firsthand, in many respects, a civil rights march being attacked by police. And the film clip would be juxtaposed with a statement issued by the government of Northern Ireland saying that the police had acted in a very respectable manner. And the juxtaposition would be really quite stark, and would really help to undermine the government of Northern Ireland, because their position would come under attack. Television would illustrate to many people inside of Ireland, but most especially in the United Kingdom, that there was something really wrong inside of Northern Ireland. And as British viewers began to pay attention to what was taking place, this put pressure on the government of Northern Ireland to initiate a number of reforms that would fully enfranchise the minority population inside of the province.